In June of 2020, during the PlayStation 5 reveal event, we were treated to the first look at Resident Evil Village. The trailer got my attention because it looked like it was implementing a bunch of ideas that they toyed with during the development of Resident Evil 4, before settling in on what that game was going to be, so my curiosity was piqued to say the least. By the time we made it to 2021, Capcom had shown off more trailers, what felt like a dozen different demos, and perhaps most amusingly of all, took the internet by storm with the introduction of Lady Dimitrescu. But all of the memes in the world won't mean a thing if the game isn't any good. So let's take a look to see how Resident Evil Village keeps the momentum that the series has had for the past few years. Resident Evil Village is the second main series game to be set in a first-person perspective. The crafting system for ammo and health items also makes a comeback. Village leans further into the action side of things than 7 did, however. This becomes clear when you receive a handgun, complete the first enemy encounter, and then obtain the shotgun inside of the same 20 minutes. That's not to say the game doesn't have its quieter, atmospheric moments as well, but it seems to strike a similar action-to-horror ratio as Resident Evil 4. The game deliberately calls back to Resident Evil 4 in a few other ways as well, such as the return of the Tetris briefcase inventory system, as well as having a new merchant character. The Duke, as he's called, will sell you supplies as well as attachments and upgrade for your weapons. He also cooks for you, which I believe grants Ethan permanent upgrades to stats such as health and defense. I never partook in the cooking because upgrading my stats seemed superfluous, and to the game's credit, I was never punished for not taking these upgrades. Beating the game was perfectly manageable without them. The main reason that I decided upgrading my stats would not be worth it is because I found this game to be remarkably easy. The enemy AI didn't feel all that intelligent, and it seemed as if most of the Lycans or other regular type enemies could be reliably put down with 3 or so headshots, or lined up for a shotgun blast to several of them. It amuses me because the game constantly gives you ways to mitigate being overwhelmed by giving you shelves to push in front of doors or other such obstructions to funnel the enemies through, but I never really had to make use of those. There was one point where I had an enemy one-on-one, so I pulled out my knife and just ran circles around it until I sliced it to death. Sucker never even hit me. On top of the enemies being rather easy, the game is pretty generous with how it hands out its resources as well. Between the amount of ammo the game was giving me, as well as the supplies to make more ammo, I was never really struggling to have any resources until one of the final areas in the game. This in turn made some of the bigger enemies, and even some of the bosses, a non-issue, since I could just unload a copious amount of shotgun shells or grenades into whatever I couldn't kill with the handgun. To be clear, I'm not condemning the game for being a little bit on the easier side, because I was still enjoying my time with it. It's just interesting coming from the remakes of 2 and 3, where as few as 2 zombies could ruin my day if I wasn't being careful, to this game where I can take down a screen full of Lycans before ever needing to heal. If the typical B-movie cheesiness found in the Resident Evil stories is something that you enjoy, this game has got you covered. The setup is as follows. Protagonist Ethan Winters has his daughter taken away by Chris Redfield. Things go wrong when Chris is trying to transport Ethan and his daughter, so Ethan stumbles backwards into this wacky werewolf village in search of his missing child. From there, he meets some of the village's notable figures and is subject to a number of different horrors, most of which involve mutilating his hands. The story of the game is not anything remarkable, but it is fun enough, and backed up by some stellar performances from the villain crew. Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters are quite entertaining and psychotic. Heisenberg also has a great, equally as bombastic performance behind him. Watching him and Dimitrescu argue in their introduction was a lot of fun. Even Chris Redfield, who I've never particularly cared for, felt more natural in this antagonistic sort of role they put him in for this game. The one weak link in the cast, however, is the protagonist, Ethan Winters. Aside from a line or two, every time Ethan began talking, I wanted to punch him in the mouth. It's strange, you'd think I would be able to sympathize with a character with a motivation as solid as trying to save his daughter, but oh man, does Ethan make it tough. Still, overall, the story is good enough for what it is, and the villains make it a very entertaining affair. On a visual level, Resident Evil Village is gorgeous. The RE engine is one of the best looking engines in recent years, and all of the awesome environments in this game do wonders to show it off. Be it the Dimitrescu Castle or the Benevito house on the cliff with the waterfall behind it, all of these areas look wonderful. Given that this is a horror game, I should probably talk about how scary the game is. Personally, I didn't find it to be all that scary. So hey, if you're someone who's interested in the genre, but maybe don't have nerves of steel, this could be a good way to try and get into the horror genre. Don't get me wrong though, the game is plenty atmospheric and took its time to have quieter and more eerie moments placed in between all of the enemy encounters. So while I was never personally intimidated, I can appreciate the effort that went into making the attempt. The cool thing is that when shifting from one major area in the game to another, the game will change up its approach to its style of horror. For example, Lady Dimitrescu's castle has a very clearly gothic horror vibe to it, and gameplay-wise it feels very similar to exploring the Spencer Mansion or the Raccoon City Police Department. And in contrast, the following area feels like something resembling PT more than the game you've been playing for the past few hours. It was cool to see, and most of the areas had an interesting approach, with only one not really doing it for me. Resident Evil Village was certainly entertaining enough for me to recommend. While I didn't enjoy it as much as the two remakes from the recent years, it still has its own merits. It manages to take a more action-leaning approach while not completely abandoning the notion of being a horror game. The village and its surrounding areas are thematically similar enough to feel like a collection of entertaining haunted carnival attractions. The carnival-like approach also means that even if the current attraction isn't quite your cup of tea, the amount of variation in delivering the scares means you may still be interested in what comes next.